Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm glad you could join me for this journey. When the waiter set the main course in front of them, the heaviness in Ethan's chest only grew. He had prepared for this evening, hoping to salvage what was left of his marriage. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. Melanie let out a breath and set her wine glass down with an alarming calm. She leaned forward, her emerald green eyes locked on him. "Ethan," she hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I'm leaving you." Silence crashed over the table like a tidal wave. Ethan didn't even flinch. He simply smiled. Melanie's confidence faltered for the first time that evening. Her lips parted, and a flicker of confusion crossed her face, and before she could speak again, the restaurant doors swung open. Ethan didn't even turn his head. There was no need. Melanie, however, went pale, because the man who had just entered was the last person she expected to see here, and he had come for her. But before we dive deeper into the story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss what happens next. Ethan Carter had spent the last 20 years building a life most men only dream of. At 42, he was a self-taught architect in Austin, Texas, known for his sharp eye for design and an even sharper mind for business. He started from the bottom, working his way through college with long nights on construction sites, studying blueprints under the dim glow of fluorescent lights, learning every detail of what makes a structure strong, durable, eternal. The same philosophy guided his life. Build something solid, invest in the foundation, and make sure no storm can tear it down. His career reflected that belief. Sleek, modern office buildings and luxury homes bearing his name were testaments to his talent, his relentless work ethic, and his ability to create something lasting. Clients respected him, colleagues admired him, and his employees knew him as a leader who expected the best because he gave no less. But beyond the accolades and success, Ethan always measured his true wealth by his family. His marriage to Melanie, or Mel, as he always called her, was once the cornerstone of his world. At 39, she was just as dazzling, with the same captivating smile that had drawn him in when they were in their early 20s. She had charm, wit, and an undeniable presence that made people gravitate towards her. When they first met, she was a bright marketing graduate with ambitions and a fire that rivaled his own. They built a life together, 2 beautiful children, a magnificent home, shared memories that at one point seemed unbreakable. For years, Ethan believed their love was like the buildings he designed, structured, solid, built to withstand the test of time. But lately, cracks had begun to appear in that foundation, at first barely noticeable, like hairline fractures in a wall, barely visible unless you were specifically looking for them. It was in the way Mel started coming home later than usual, her excuses vague and unconvincing, in the way she would turn her phone screen away when he entered the room, a quick flick of her fingers silencing a notification. In the way she stopped looking at him the way she used to, as if he were just another piece of furniture in their home. Familiar, functional, but no longer thrilling. Ethan wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he was a man who trusted his instinct, and his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. At first he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress, the natural ebbs and flows of a long marriage. They had weathered hard times before, periods when work consumed him, times when the demands of parenting drained them both. But this time felt different. There was a distance between them now, growing wider every day, no matter how hard he tried to bridge it. Conversations became transactional, filled with discussions about the kids, errands, schedules, everything but themselves. The warmth had faded, replaced by something colder, more detached. And then came the lies. Small at first, but undeniable. business trips that didn't quite add up, dinners with girlfriends he never met, the lingering scent of another man's cologne on her clothes. Ethan had spent years designing spaces meant to stand the test of time. But now, sitting in the home they had built together, he couldn't shake the feeling that his marriage was already crumbling, piece by piece. The Gilded Oak was the kind of place that exuded elegance without even trying. Located in the heart of Austin, it was the perfect blend of cozy and refined. Muted lighting in warm amber hues, polished wood accents, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Jazz played softly, just enough to set a mood, but never intrude on conversation. It was the kind of restaurant where anniversaries were celebrated, deals were closed, and quiet moments of importance unfolded by candlelight over meticulously plated dishes. Ethan had chosen this place intentionally, knowing Mel had always loved it. It had been years since their last dinner here, but he remembered her once calling it our place, back when they still had things that belonged just to them. He had planned the evening carefully, booking the table weeks in advance to secure the best one by the window. He went the extra mile, ordering her favorite wine from that specific vintage, a rich red she once said tasted like old love letters and late-night confessions. He'd even ordered a small, custom gift, an elegant gold bracelet with their wedding date engraved inside the clasp. Something simple, but meaningful. A reminder of everything they had built together. He told himself this evening wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about desperation. It was about hope. About finding a way back to each other before the silence between them became permanent. As he sat across from her, watching the flickering candlelight cast shadows across her face, he wondered if she could feel the weight of his effort. Mel looked effortlessly beautiful as always, her blonde hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders, the emerald green dress hugging her frame, a reminder of the woman he'd fallen in love with. But there was a cautious detachment in her expression that spoke of obligation, not desire. She had agreed to the dinner, but she wasn't truly here. He could feel it in the way she barely met his eyes, the way she politely sipped her wine, the way she seemed almost impatient, as if waiting for something to be over, rather than enjoying the moment. Ethan tried to shake the feeling, pushing through the tension with a forced smile, raising his glass for a toast. "To us," he said, hoping she could hear the quiet plea in his words. Mel hesitated for a half-second before raising her glass. "To us," she repeated, but there was no warmth in it, just the mechanical politeness of someone performing a duty. He should have known then, should have realized this evening wouldn't be the turning point he'd hoped for. But he was still clinging, still holding on to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could fix what was broken. And then, just as the waiter set their main courses before them, Mel put her glass down, leaned forward slightly, and with a voice as smooth as the wine she was sipping, said, "I've been having an affair for the last 2 years, and I'm leaving you." The words hung with a quiet finality, like a stone dropped into deep water. Ethan felt the world tilt for a split second, a moment of surreal detachment as his mind struggled to grasp the weight of what had just been said. But instead of reacting with anger or disbelief, instead of demanding explanations or begging for answers, he simply smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't calculated. It was something else entirely. Something raw and knowing, a reaction that made Mel falter for the first time all evening. Her brows furrowed in confusion, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind 100 times, but never accounted for this response. Before she could speak, before she could try to reclaim control of the moment, the restaurant door swung open. The sound of heels clicking on marble and the hum of quiet conversation faded into the background as he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a custom navy blue suit. Ryan Hale radiated the effortless arrogance of a man who was never told no. Ethan didn't need to turn to confirm his identity. He saw it in the way Mel's face went white, the way her hand involuntarily clenched the tablecloth, the way she suddenly looked like a woman caught in a disaster of her own making. Ethan simply leaned back in his chair, took a slow sip of his wine, his eyes never leaving her. "Well," he said, setting his glass down with deliberate slowness, "this just got more interesting." A wave of recognition rippled through the restaurant, like a slowly building swell. Conversations died down, gazes drifted toward the man who had just entered, and in that moment, Ethan felt the atmosphere shift. It wasn't just curiosity. It was contempt. Someone whispered to their companion, others exchanged knowing looks, but no one welcomed him. No firm handshakes, no casual nods, just a restrained, simmering dislike reserved for men whose reputations preceded them. Ryan Hale either didn't notice or didn't care. He walked with the confidence of a man who had never been held accountable, ignorant or indifferent to the weight his name carried in certain circles. Ethan leaned back, studying Mel's reaction. She sat frozen, her fingers pressing into the linen tablecloth, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and poorly concealed panic. For the first time that evening, she looked scared. Not of Ethan, not even of the moment unraveling before her, but of something deeper, something she hadn't accounted for. She had planned to control this conversation, to dictate how this evening would go. But she had made a critical miscalculation. She didn't realize Ethan already knew everything. His gaze slid to Ryan, and for the first time in many years, Ethan allowed himself to fully acknowledge the man standing before him. It wasn't just about the affair. It wasn't just another man stealing his wife. It was the man who had once stood in Ethan's way, deliberately, methodically, with the precision of someone who never wanted to see him succeed. Ryan Hale wasn't just a lawyer. He was a gatekeeper, the kind of man who wielded power like a scalpel, who masked discrimination as policy, who kept men like Ethan in their place under the guise of standards and protocol. Years ago, when Ethan was on the verge of landing the biggest contract of his career, a multi-million-dollar urban redevelopment project, Ryan was the one who blocked him. Not because Ethan lacked the experience, not because his designs were inferior, but because, as Ryan so casually stated in a closed-door meeting, Ethan was an unproven risk. Unproven risk, a sanitized way of saying, you don't belong here. Ethan had spent months fighting that decision, digging into Ryan's legal history, trying to find something, anything, that exposed what everyone knew but couldn't prove. Ryan had a history of blocking projects from minority-owned firms, always justifying it with bureaucratic red tape and legal loopholes. Ethan had never forgotten that defeat, how he'd swallowed the humiliation, forced himself to move on, rebuild, succeed in spite of men like Ryan Hale. And now, years later, here he stood, the man who had tried to destroy him, the man who had dismissed him as insignificant, sitting across from Ethan's wife, the very woman who had once claimed to believe in everything he fought for. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling into his palm before he forced himself to relax. Not yet. He turned to Mel, letting the weight of his silence settle before he spoke. "You didn't just cheat," he said, his voice quiet, measured, with something sharp at the edge. "You sided with a man who works against everything I stand for." Mel's breath hitched, her lips parting slightly as if she had something to say, but nothing came out. She hadn't expected this. She'd prepared for anger, maybe even for heartbreak. She wasn't prepared for this calm, deadly clarity. Ethan let the moment stretch, watching the realization sink into her. "Tell me," he continued, tilting his head slightly. Was it easy to forget what I told you about him? To disregard the kind of man he is? Or did you just not care? Mel swallowed, her throat bobbing noticeably. Ethan, no. He cut her off smoothly, his voice still quiet, still eerily controlled. You made your choice. Own it. Ryan shifted, finally sensing the conversation veering into dangerous territory. I don't think now is the time or place for... Ethan raised a hand, silencing him with a look. You and I both know exactly who you are, he said firmly, and so does everyone else in this room. Ryan's gaze darted around, scanning the restaurant, and for the first time, Ethan saw it. The crack in the arrogance, the realization that this wasn't just another private confrontation. This was public. The carefully constructed walls of power and influence Ryan had always relied on for protection suddenly seemed a little thinner. Mel sat rigidly, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass, as if it were the only thing holding her in place. The air between them felt charged, electric with unspoken words and the weight of irreversible choices. And then Ethan did something that made them both flinch. He smiled. Ethan reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, moving with that deliberate slowness that made both Mel and Ryan visibly tense. He pulled out a stark black envelope, its edges crisp and untouched, as if prepared for this very moment. Without a word, he slid it across the table, releasing it with a quiet finality that sent a chill down Mel's spine. She didn't move, didn't even blink, but her breathing changed, shallower, faster. Ryan, on the other hand, let out a sharp exhale through his nose, clearly irritated by the theatrics. What is this supposed to be? He muttered, but Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, watching, waiting. Mel hesitated, then slowly reached for the envelope, opening it with trembling fingers. The moment her eyes skimmed the first page, her entire body went still. Ethan saw it. Her pupils dilated slightly, her jaw clenching for a fraction of a second too long. A tell that she knew exactly what she was looking at, even without turning the second page. Ryan, losing patience, leaned over to look over her shoulder. At first, his expression was unreadable, but as he took in the details, the smug ease with which he'd entered the restaurant cracked. His brows drew together, a flicker of confusion turning into something darker, something dangerously close to betrayal. Ethan tilted his head slightly, finally breaking the silence. Go on, read it out loud, Mel, he said, his voice smooth, almost casual. She couldn't. She didn't. So he did it for her. For the last 6 months, you've been draining our accounts. Not all at once. No, that would be too obvious. Small transfers. A few thousand here, 5 there. Always spaced out enough to avoid red flags. But added all up. It's over 200,000, Mel. 200,000, quietly funneled from our shared assets into this account. He tapped the page with one finger, watching her face contort as if she were physically trying to stop the words from falling. An account in Ryan's name. Ryan stiffened. Wait, what? Mel finally moved, slamming the envelope shut so fast the pages nearly crumpled. Ethan, this isn't what you think, she began, her voice strained. But he just laughed quietly. Oh, Mel, he said, shaking his head. It's exactly what it looks like. Ryan snatched the envelope from her hands, opening it again, his eyes racing over the numbers, his nostrils flaring as the realization dawned on him. You used my name for this? His voice lost its smooth confidence, replaced by something sharp and accusatory. What the hell were you planning, Mel? To bleed him dry and run off with my money? For the first time that evening, Mel looked genuinely shocked. Not just caught off guard, but truly frightened. No, that's not it, she said quickly, turning to him. I was going to tell you. Ryan's fist clenched on the tablecloth, his jaw tight as he looked at her. "Tell me what exactly? That you were setting me up? That you were going to run as soon as his money hit my account?" Ethan smiled again, this time slower, a predator watching as his prey turned on itself. "Ah," he murmured, lazily swirling his wineglass. "So you didn't know. That's interesting." Ryan turned back to Mel, his expression darkening. "Is that why you were rushing things? Pushing me to wrap it all up? Planning to cut corners and run?" Mel's lips parted, but this time she had nothing to say. Because there was no lie, no excuse, no well-constructed twist that could pull her out of this. Ethan let out a breath, shaking his head. "You thought you were smart, Mel. You really did. But you made a mistake. You underestimated me. You thought I wouldn't notice the missing money, that I wouldn't trace it. But the moment I felt something was off, I started looking. And once I started looking..." He leaned forward slightly, his smile now cold. "I found everything." Mel swallowed hard, but before she could try to save herself, Ryan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping back against the floor. His entire demeanor had changed. He no longer looked like a man in control, no longer looked like the one with the power. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd been used. "You're unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "I should have known." Ethan took another slow sip of his wine, watching Mel struggle to find her footing, to find a way to regain control of a narrative that had so brutally slipped through her fingers. But there was nothing left to grasp, because the truth was already lying there, black and white. Ethan swirled the deep red wine in his glass, letting the weight of the silence settle over the table. Mel's fingers twitched at the edge of the tablecloth, her knuckles white as she shot a glance at Ryan, who stood rigid, his jaw clenched with barely restrained fury. The realization that she had played him just as she had Ethan was quickly sinking in, and for the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, Ryan no longer looked like the most powerful man in the room. Ethan set his glass down, and with a slow, deliberate motion, raised his hand and nodded once. It was a signal. Immediately, the quiet hum of the restaurant shifted, the scrape of chairs, the rustle of movement, and then, one by one, people began to stand up. The man at the bar, another from a nearby corner booth, and finally, 2 women from separate tables along the edge of the dining room. Ethan didn't turn to look at them. There was no need. He already knew who they were. Joel Parker, his private investigator, had been working the case for months. A former detective turned independent PI. Joel possessed the kind of presence that made people think twice about underestimating him. Lean, gray-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He stepped forward, casually resting one hand on the back of Ethan's chair, the other tucked in his pocket like a man with all the time in the world. Next to him stood the 2 women, tall, their expressions a careful mix of restrained rage and satisfaction. These weren't just random people in the restaurant. They were victims of Ryan Hale. Women whose lives he had ruined, whose businesses he had sabotaged, whose reputations he had dragged through the mud to serve his own interests. And then, there was her. Charlotte Graves, a journalist known for exposing corruption in high places, stepped forward. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, her eyes sharp as a blade, already assessing the damage before she even spoke. Ryan tensed, his hands curling into fists as he scanned the room, the realization dawning too late. Mel, meanwhile, looked frozen in place, her gaze darting feverishly between them, finally understanding there was nowhere to run. Charlotte was the first to break the silence. "Ryan Hale," she said, her voice carrying through the restaurant with a clarity that commanded attention. "Didn't expect to see me here tonight, did you?" Ryan's expression barely changed, but Ethan could see it. The quick calculation, the desperate search for an exit strategy. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Ryan muttered, his voice low, controlled. Joel chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, you do." He pulled a thick, sealed envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the table in front of Ryan. "That's every document, email, and bank statement linking you to the fraudulent contracts, hush money payments, and shell companies you used to launder money through your firm. It's airtight." He smirked, tilting his head. "You've been a very busy man." One of the women, Ava Marshall, stepped forward next, crossing her arms as she looked down at Ryan. "You destroyed my company," she said, her voice with a sharp edge of fury. "You made sure I lost every client, every investor, because I refused to play by your rules." Ryan turned to her, his jaw tight, his mask beginning to crack. You blacklisted me," the second woman, Nadia Lee, chimed in. "Told investors my firm was a liability, that I was unstable, all because I called you out on your shady contracts and insider deals." Charlotte didn't give him a chance to respond. She pulled out her phone and held it up. "And guess what? All of this is going public tonight." Mel flinched. "Wait." "Publicly?" she whispered, as if only just realizing the scale of what was happening. Charlotte's smile was razor-sharp. "Oh, don't worry, Mel. You'll be in the story, too." She tapped the screen. "I mean, it's not every day a marketing exec gets caught funneling money from her husband into her corrupt affair partner's account. That's a headline." Mel spun to face Ryan, her voice dropping to a frantic hiss. "Ryan, say something!" Ryan didn't look at her. He was already calculating his escape, scanning the room, realizing he'd been used, cornered. And Ethan saw it, how self-preservation outweighed everything else. Ryan took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and then did exactly what Ethan expected. He threw Mel under the bus. "It wasn't me," Ryan said suddenly, stepping back from her. "I had no idea about the money transfers. This was all Mel." Mel recoiled as if she'd been struck. "Ryan, what?" Ryan turned to Ethan, his expression shifting to something almost apologetic, as if he thought he could cut a deal and walk away clean. "Listen, Ethan, I think we can both agree that Mel—" Ethan laughed. "Oh, don't you dare try to spin this like you're the victim here." Ryan clenched his jaw, his control slipping fast. "You have no proof that I—" Joel sighed, pulling out his phone and tapping the screen. A second later, Ryan's voice filled the space a recorded conversation. "She won't notice a thing. The money will be in my name, and once it's cleared, we disappear." Mel staggered back. "You son of a bitch." Ryan turned on her now, his mask completely shattered. "Oh, shut up, Mel. You knew exactly what this was." The entire restaurant was frozen, the weight of the confrontation sinking in. Ethan slowly exhaled, finally pushing his chair back and standing with a calm, unshakable confidence. He looked at Mel, at Ryan, at the ruins of their own making. Then he turned to Charlotte. "Do it," he said. Charlotte tapped her phone one last time, and just like that, the world learned everything. The weight of the moment settled thickly in the air, but before anyone could speak, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Carter, sir." Ethan turned his head, his eyes settling on the waiter standing a few feet away, his hands folded in front of him, his expression cautious. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with the tired look of a man deciding whether to speak, but ultimately deciding the truth outweighed comfort. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Yes." The waiter swallowed, shifting slightly on his feet before lowering his voice, so only Ethan could hear. "I think you should know. She's been bringing him here for months." Ethan didn't react immediately, didn't even blink. He just sat, absorbing the words, letting them seep into his skin, into his bones. He felt Mel tense across from him, heard her sharp intake of breath, but didn't look at her. Not yet. Instead, he focused on the waiter, measuring the truth in his expression, in the careful way he avoided looking at Mel at all, as if he knew he'd just dropped a bomb in the middle of the table. "You're sure about that?" Ethan asked, his voice unreadable. The waiter nodded, firmly now, as if having decided that if he was going to speak, there was no backing down. "Yes, sir. The same table, usually by the window, always around this time of night. I remember because they always ordered the same wine. The one you ordered tonight." Ethan slowly exhaled, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just infidelity. It was here. In this restaurant. In the very place he had chosen tonight because it meant something. The place where they'd celebrated anniversaries, promotions, birthdays. The place that had once been theirs. Mel shifted in her seat, her hand jerking as if she were going to reach for his, but she thought better of it. "Ethan, He finally looked at her, and whatever she saw in his face made her mouth clamp shut. "You didn't even have the decency to cheat somewhere else." His voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but there was something in it. Something so cold, so deeply disappointed, that it cut sharper than any scream. Mel's lips parted, her eyes wide, frantically trying to find something, anything, to soften the moment. "It's not." "Don't," Ethan cut her off, slowly shaking his head. "Just don't. Because now I get it. It was never just about the lying, was it? It wasn't just about fucking behind my back." He leaned forward, putting his forearms on the table, his voice dropping low enough to make her flinch. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to do it where you knew I would eventually find out. Maybe you wanted me to know. Maybe it turned you on." Mel's face flushed red, her nails digging into the tablecloth. "That's not true," she whispered. But even she didn't sound convinced. Ethan just laughed, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. Because it's over. And now, so are you." The restaurant door swung open again, the faint chime of the entrance bell cutting through the heavy silence that had fallen over the table. Mel barely reacted at first, her mind clearly still frantically searching for a way out. But Ethan knew, before he even turned his head, who had just walked in. The energy in the room shifted, the kind that happens when someone who is absolutely not to be messed with enters. Camille Carter walked in with the confidence that comes after years of tearing men like Ryan Hale apart in courtrooms. Tall, put together, and completely unshaken by the weight of the moment, she moved with purpose, a sleek leather briefcase under her arm, her expression sharp and unreadable. Ethan's older sister had always been a force, but today she was something more. Today, she was the executioner. She paid no attention to anyone else, approaching the table, not even glancing at Mel or Ryan. She walked straight to Ethan, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder in silent solidarity, before turning her attention to the man across from them. Ryan tensed. Mel, finally registering the shift, frowned, her confusion flickering into unease. "Camille? What are you?" Camille ignored her, placing the briefcase on the table with an intentional thud. Slowly, with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this very moment, she unclasped it and pulled out a thick folder of printed documents. Without a single word, she slapped it down in front of Ryan. Ethan watched as Ryan hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly, before he forced himself to reach for the folder. He opened it, his eyes racing over the first few pages, and Ethan saw the very moment the color drained from his face. Camille tilted her head. "Go on," she said, her voice smooth, deadly. "Read it." Ryan said nothing. Mel, completely thrown, leaned over to look herself. She barely skimmed 3 sentences before she recoiled, as if physically struck. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Ethan let the silence stretch, let it sink into her. Then, finally, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Tell me, Mel," he uttered, his voice deceptively light. "What's it like to know you were never anything more than a pawn?" Mel's throat worked as she swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. This isn't true." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Oh, it's very true." She flipped through the pages before stopping on one in particular, with the look of a person unveiling the final damning evidence in a high-profile lawsuit. She read aloud. "She's useful for now. She thinks she's playing me, but she doesn't realize she's just another piece on the board." The words hung in the air like a noose tightening around Mel's throat. Her head snapped toward Ryan, her eyes wide, frantic. "Tell me that's not true," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Tell me you didn't say that." Ryan didn't answer, didn't even look at her, and that was all the confirmation she needed. Mel's hands trembled, her entire body going rigid as the truth settled into her bones. She had never been his partner, never his equal, never anything more than a temporary distraction, a tool he planned to discard once she outlived her usefulness. Ethan exhaled, watching the last remnants of whatever illusions she'd been clinging to finally crumble. Ryan pushed the folder away, his jaw tight. "You think you've won." His voice was lower now, coiled with barely restrained rage. Camille smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was a smile that promised ruin. "Oh, sweetheart," she said smoothly. "We're just getting started." Ryan stood up abruptly, as if the act of leaving could separate him from this moment. But Camille moved faster, stepping in front of him before he could take a single step. Her voice dropped, cold and sharp. "Sit down," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "You and I have unfinished business." And just like that, for the first time all evening, Ryan Hale had no way out. By dawn, the world knew everything. Ethan woke to the sound of his phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. Notifications were coming in like waves crashing on a shore. He let it ring, let it vibrate, let it do whatever it wanted. He already knew what it was. While the city slept, Charlotte had worked. The article had gone live at 5:42 a.m., and by the time the first cups of coffee were being poured on office desks, it had exploded across every major news outlet. Social media was ablaze with headlines spreading like wildfire. Prominent attorney Ryan Hale exposed in corruption, fraud, and affair scandal. Marketing exec Melanie Carter implicated in financial fraud and corporate misconduct. Legal titan disbarred after investigation reveals years of shady dealings. This wasn't just a local story. This was national news. Ethan finally picked up his phone and scrolled through the endless stream of messages. Texts from colleagues, business partners, old friends. Some were checking on him, others offering congratulations, because in their world, power plays were common. But seeing a man like Ryan Hale fall, that was rare. And Mel. She had fallen right along with him. He threw off the covers and got up, working the heaviness of the previous night out of his limbs as he moved to the kitchen. He turned on the TV, flipping channels until he landed on one of the morning news broadcasts. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Fall of a high-profile attorney. Corruption, blackmail, and the affair that ended it all." The reporter's voice was crisp, detached, professionally so, but the words cut deep. In a stunning revelation last night, Ryan Hale, a well-known corporate attorney famous for his high-stakes legal battles, was exposed in a web of fraudulent deals, blackmail, and a 2-year affair with marketing executive Melanie Carter. According to reports, Hale engaged in unethical practices, including blocking minority-led businesses from high-value contracts, falsifying legal documentation, and using coercive tactics against former business associates. Additionally, leaked financial records show that Carter, married at the time, was transferring funds into an account under Hale's name, allegedly in an attempt to secure a financial escape plan before the affair came to light. Ethan sipped his coffee, watching it all unfold. Every piece. The camera switched to footage of Ryan leaving his firm's headquarters, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, pushing through reporters as they hurled questions at him. "Mr. Hale, do you have a statement regarding the allegations? Is it true your law firm has terminated your contract? What do you have to say to the victims of your legal manipulations?" Ryan didn't answer, because there was no answer that could save him now. His firm had cut ties with him within hours of the article's release. The partners wasted no time, issuing an official statement, making it clear they were distancing themselves completely. Hale Associates does not condone the actions outlined in recent reports and will fully cooperate with any upcoming investigations. Effectively immediately, Mr. Hale is no longer associated with our firm in any capacity. Ethan smirked. The man who had spent years ruining lives was now watching his own life unravel in real time. Then came the lawsuits. Camille wasted no time. By noon, several former clients had come forward, each with their own set of grievances, each filing legal suits against Ryan for fraud, contract tampering, and unlawful business interference. Some cases would take time to build, but others were on solid ground. Disbarment was looming. Prison time wasn't off the table either. And Mel, her downfall was just as brutal. The same morning news segment shifted to a new headline: "Marketing executive fired following financial misconduct allegations." It was over. Her company issued a swift and public termination, citing a breach of ethical conduct and fiduciary trust. In simple terms, they wanted nothing to do with her. The public fallout was even worse. Her name was everywhere. Her girlfriends, the ones who filled their weekends with wine tastings and luxury brunches, abandoned her like a sinking ship. They weren't about to risk their own reputations by being associated with her. She had lost everything overnight: her job, her social standing, the illusion of control. So Ethan could only imagine what her phone must have looked like. Texts from friends who suddenly stopped responding. Calls from family members demanding to know what she had done. And yet, one message she didn't send. To him. He wasn't sure if she was too ashamed, too angry, or too deep in denial to reach out. But it didn't matter, because he wasn't going to save her. She had made her choices. Now she had to live with them. Meanwhile, Camille made sure every one of Ryan's victims got their justice. Ava Marshall, the businesswoman Ryan had sabotaged, had already begun rebuilding her company with Camille's legal support. Nadia Lee, the woman Ryan had blacklisted, was now preparing a public lawsuit. And from the way Camille was talking to reporters, it was clear this wasn't just about destroying Ryan. It was about making sure men like him never held power again. When Ethan turned off the TV and leaned against the counter, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. For the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like he was drowning in unanswered questions. He didn't feel the weight of trying to fix something broken beyond repair. He felt free. And Ryan. Mel. They were the ones left picking up the pieces. It was late, just past 9 p.m., when the knock came. A slow, hesitant tap, tap, tap on the wooden door. Ethan didn't move at first. He sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in one hand, the soft hum of music in the background. The kids were asleep upstairs, their steady breathing the only sound that truly mattered in this house now. He already knew who it was before he even stood, hauling himself to the door. He exhaled through his nose, rolling the tension from his shoulders before unlocking it. When he opened it, the porch light cast a dull glow on the woman standing before him. Mel. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat across from him at the Gilded Oak that night, full of arrogance, confidence, and carefully curated detachment. Now she looked hollow, stripped of whatever armor she had once worn. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair hung limply around her face, her makeup smeared as if she'd been crying long before she got here. She was thinner, paler than he remembered, in a jacket too light for the chilly night air. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Ethan just stood and waited. She shifted on her feet, licking her lips as if trying to figure out where to start, how to pull him into the desperate plea she'd rehearsed in her mind before coming here. But no words would save her now. Finally, her voice broke through the silence, cracked. "Ethan, I've lost everything." His grip tightened slightly on the doorknob, but his face remained unreadable. Mel swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "Please, let us talk." He let the words hang, let them hang in the cold night air between them, as useless as they were pathetic. Let's talk. She wanted to talk now, after everything. She had stood in that restaurant, confident, telling him she was leaving. She had sat across from him as another man walked through the doors, the man she had chosen over him. She had planned to bleed him dry, disappear into some fantasy she'd built in her mind. And when it all collapsed, when her carefully constructed world turned to ash, she came to him not for forgiveness. She came because she had nowhere else to go. Mel shifted again, biting her lip. I wasn't thinking straight, Ethan. I made a mistake. I see that now." Her voice was fragile, but he could hear it beneath the surface. The expectation, the belief that if she looked broken enough, he would let her back in. "A mistake?" Ethan laughed quietly, slowly shaking his head. "A mistake?" His voice was calm, but beneath it was something sharp as a razor. "No, Mel. Forgetting an anniversary is a mistake. Missing a flight is a mistake. What you did, that was a choice." She flinched. "Ethan, You lied to me," he continued, his voice never rising. "You stole from me. You humiliated me in public. You threw away our family, our marriage, everything. For what? For a man who used you as a convenient distraction?" Mel shook her head, taking a frantic step forward. No, it wasn't like that." "Don't stand on my porch and lie to me," he cut her off, his tone making her freeze. "Not anymore." She looked like she was about to come apart, her shoulders hunched, her lip trembling. "Ethan, please." Her voice broke. "I have nothing left. No job, no place to stay. She wiped her face, swallowing a sob. "I just need a chance. To fix this." A cold, empty laugh slipped from his lips. "We're done, Mel. We have been for a long time. And if you really thought you could show up here, and I would just... What? Take you back? Forget everything you did? I wasn't myself," she whispered desperately. "I wasn't thinking clearly." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "No, Mel, you were thinking very clearly." He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "You were clear when you were sneaking around with Ryan for 2 years. You were clear when you were taking money from our accounts. You were clear when you let me sit in that restaurant waiting for my wife to tell me she was leaving me. You were clear when you made your choice." Mel's face twisted. Ethan looked at her, but felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no triumph. Just clarity. She was nothing to him now. Just a woman who had once had everything and threw it away. Her voice was now barely a whisper. "What am I supposed to do now?" For a moment, Ethan just looked at her, looked at the ruins of who she had become, and then, without a single word, without a single glance, he shut the door in her face. The click of the lock, and it was over. Ethan found solace in the steady rhythm of his hands working with wood, the smell of sawdust, the rough texture of raw material under his fingertips, the sharp sound of a chisel biting into grain. It became his escape, his therapy, his rebirth. What started as a distraction soon became an obsession. He spent late nights in the garage, shaping, sanding, building. There was something deeply satisfying about turning something rough and unfinished into something beautiful and lasting. Unlike his marriage, unlike the life he had once so desperately tried to hold on to, this was something that couldn't betray him. At first, he built furniture just for himself, creating pieces to replace what Mel had taken when she left. A dining table sturdy and solid, where his kids could sit and share a meal. A bookshelf for his daughter, who had recently discovered a love for reading. A handcrafted desk for his son, who needed a quiet place for school projects. It started small, but word spread. A neighbor saw the coffee table he'd made and asked if he took commissions. Then a friend from work asked for a custom shelving unit. Soon, he had more orders than he could handle. And before he knew it, what had been a coping mechanism had turned into a full-fledged business. It felt good to build something that was his, something that was growing, something he controlled. There was no deceit in it, no betrayal. Just his craftsmanship, his sweat, his effort, turning simple pieces of wood into something of value. And that's how he met her. Sophie Dawson entered his life the way some people enter a bookstore, quietly, unassumingly, but with a presence that makes you look twice. She owned a small independent bookstore in the city, one of those few places that still smelled of real paper and ink, where people browsed shelves instead of scrolling screens. He had wandered in one Saturday, looking for a book for his daughter, and found himself standing before the woman who would change everything. She was nothing like Mel. If Mel was always polished, calculated, Sophie was warm, effortless, genuine. She had a way of talking that made people feel at ease, a way of smiling that didn't feel designed to impress anyone. It was just real. She recognized his name as he was paying at the counter. "Ethan Carter," she murmured, tapping the side of the card reader. "The Ethan Carter who builds furniture. I saw your work at a friend's place the other day. It's incredible." It caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being recognized for anything unrelated to the scandal, the betrayal, the mess of Mel. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just nodded. "Yeah, that's me," she grinned. "I might need some new bookshelves for the shop. Think you'd be interested?" And so it began. Slowly. Simply. Without expectations. Without hidden agendas. Without complications. Over the next few months, he built bookshelves for her. She made him coffee when he delivered them. She asked questions about his work, actually listened to the answers. They talked about things that weren't painful, about favorite books, childhood memories, places they wanted to visit. It was easy. For a long time, Ethan thought he could never trust anyone again. Mel's betrayal had made him cautious, made him question every motive, every intention. But Sophie, she never asked for anything, never pushed, never dredged up his past. She just showed up, day after day, moment after moment, until Ethan realized he wasn't holding his breath around her anymore. One evening, after he'd installed the last of her shelves, she handed him a beer instead of coffee. They sat on the floor of the bookstore, their backs against the counter, the smell of freshly cut wood mingling with the rich scent of old books. "Ever think about expanding?" she asked, tilting her head toward him. "Turning the woodworking into something bigger?" He took a slow sip of his drink, thinking, "I don't know. I like keeping it small. It feels personal." She nodded, considering. "That makes sense. But I still think more people should see your work. It's special." He'd heard compliments before, from clients, from friends. But somehow, when she said it, it didn't feel like flattery. It felt like she actually meant it. A beat of comfortable silence stretched between them. Sophie sighed, as if she were about to say something, then hesitated. Ethan turned his head slightly, watching her. "What?" She let out a quiet, nervous laugh, shaking her head. "Nothing. I like this." She glanced at him, her eyes warm. "I like spending time with you." Something in Ethan's chest loosened. It was such a simple statement, so unassuming, but it hit him harder than he expected. He set his beer down, turning to face her fully. "I like spending time with you, too." Sophie smiled, and for the first time in a very, very long time, Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Oh, Ethan had been waiting for Ryan to make his last desperate move. It came in the form of a lawsuit. The papers arrived on a crisp Monday morning, delivered by a tense-looking courier who barely made eye contact as he handed over the envelope. Ethan didn't even need to open it to know what was inside. Ryan Hale was as predictable as any other man who built his power on arrogance and manipulation. The lawsuit, defamation. Ryan was suing for irreparable damage to his reputation, loss of professional status, and emotional distress. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so pathetic. The man who had spent years ruining lives was now claiming he was the victim. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, skimming through the legal jargon, barely suppressing a smirk. Ryan was grasping at straws. His career was in a tailspin, his name permanently tarnished, his former colleagues treating him like a disease they couldn't afford to catch. His disbarment was still pending, but everyone knew how that would end. Lawsuits against him were piling up. Clients, former business partners, people he'd exploited and discarded over the years. And yet, this was the hill he wanted to die on. Pathetic. Ethan set the papers down, picked up his phone, and dialed Camille. She answered on the first ring. "Let me guess," she said, her voice dry. Hale finally filed. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Of course he did. Camille laughed, the kind of laugh that meant she was already 10 steps ahead. He just made the biggest mistake of his life. A week later, they were in court. Ryan showed up looking polished, but haggard, like a man desperately trying to pretend he still had control. His expensive suit was custom-tailored, his hair perfectly styled, but his eyes gave him away. He was a man on the edge. Ethan walked in, calm, prepared, completely unshaken. The hearing was quick. Ryan's lawyer droned on about damaged reputation, false accusations, an alleged conspiracy against him. He painted Ryan as the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, claiming Ethan had intentionally destroyed his professional status with malicious intent. Then it was Camille's turn. She stood, her posture relaxed yet commanding, and in less than 5 minutes, she dismantled everything. She laid out the evidence, emails, recorded phone calls, fraudulent contracts. She presented a timeline of events, proving that everything Ethan had exposed was fact, not defamation. Then, with deliberate precision, she presented new evidence. A sealed file landed on the judge's desk. Ryan tensed. Ethan leaned forward, watching his opponent finally realize he had walked into his own grave. Camille's voice was smooth, controlled. "This is a sworn affidavit from one of Mr. Hale's former employees, detailing his direct involvement in case tampering, illegal payouts, and falsified court documents. These aren't allegations. They're facts." Silence. Ryan's lawyer opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to argue. Ryan's face went white, his confidence melting in real time. Ethan could see it, the very moment the truth settled into his bones. He had lost. The judge barely slowed down. The lawsuit was dismissed on the spot. And within 24 hours, Ryan's disbarment became official. By the end of the week, he was gone. No announcements, no statements, no fight. Just the ghost of the man he had been. sifting through the wreckage of his own making. Ethan never saw him again, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't look back. The late afternoon sun washed the backyard in a warm golden light, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. Laughter rang through the air light and carefree as Ethan watched his kids chase each other around the oak tree at the far end of the yard. His son, a teenager now, was just as protective of his little sister as always. But there was an ease between them now, a bond that had only strengthened over the years. Ethan sat on the porch, a cold beer resting on the arm of his chair, his fingers lightly tapping against the wood he had built himself. Everything around him, the house, the yard, even the furniture inside, was something he had rebuilt with his own hands, something real, something permanent. Beside him, Sophie leaned against the railing, sipping from a mug of tea, her eyes watching the kids with a soft, content expression. She had become a constant in his life, her presence woven into the fabric of their everyday moments so seamlessly, it felt as natural as breathing. She hadn't replaced anything. She had simply become a part of everything. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't waiting for the past to creep back up, wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's betrayal. He had spent so much time trying to figure out why it happened, trying to find meaning in it, trying to figure out where he went wrong. But now it didn't matter. The pain had led him here. If Mel had never walked into that restaurant and shattered his world, he would never have found this peace, this love, this life. Sophie shifted beside him, tilting her head slightly as she watched him. "You're quiet," she murmured, her voice light. He let out a breath, shaking his head with a small smile. "Just thinking." She smirked. "Dangerous." Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his beer before looking at her. "Do you ever think about how life works out? How sometimes the worst things that happen to us are the things that put us on the right path?" Sophie thought about it for a moment, her eyes softening. "Yeah," she said finally, nodding. "I think about that a lot." Ethan looked back at his kids, his heart full in a way he once thought impossible. "Betrayal isn't the end," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's just the start of something greater. The strength isn't in avoiding the pain, it's in rising above it." Sophie reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. And as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of his story were still being written. Ethan let his gaze sweep across the yard, watching the last rays of sunlight stretch across the grass, painting the world in a golden glow. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, carrying the sound of his children's laughter on the air. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything, not the burden of the past, but the depth of the present. This life, this moment, was something he had built from the wreckage. And damn, if it didn't feel good to be standing on solid ground again. He twisted the beer bottle between his fingers, his grip relaxed, his shoulders free. Sophie squeezed his hand before standing, gathering their empty cups. "I'll be inside," she said, with that knowing smile that had become a quiet reassurance in his life. She didn't need to say anything more. She understood him in ways that didn't require words. Ethan watched her go inside, then slowly exhaled, shifting his focus back to the horizon. His thoughts drifted back to all the twists and turns that had led him here. The betrayal, the chaos, the fall of the people who thought they were untouchable. Mel had never recovered from her fall. The last he heard, she was working odd jobs, barely making ends meet, a ghost of the woman who had once thought she was too good for the life she threw away. And Ryan had disappeared, vanished from the city, his name mentioned only in whispers when people talked about the lawyer who lost everything in a scandal too big to bury. In the end, the man who thought he could manipulate, steal, and destroy without consequence became little more than a cautionary tale. Karma had done what karma always does. Ethan smirked to himself, shaking his head. He turned back to the camera, leaning slightly forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His expression changed. Not angry, not bitter, just knowing. "Tell me," he uttered, his voice quiet, steady. "Have you ever seen karma in action?" He let the words settle, his eyes glinting with something sharp, undeniable. "Leave your craziest karma stories in the comments." He leaned back, letting the invitation hang, letting the weight of the question sink in. The screen slowly faded to black, but before the final shot disappeared, bold words flashed on the screen, a final message lingering like an echo. Strength isn't in avoiding the pain, but in rising from it. The past can break you or build you. The choice is yours.